Welcome everybody to Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. Today we have on David Griscom. He has a Substack called The Rattler. He's the host of the podcast Left Reckoning, or co-host, I should say, along with Matt Lech. And he's the author of an awesome book called The Myth of Red Texas. Thanks for joining us, man. We appreciate it.
Really happy to be here, y'all.
So, all right, let me cut to the chase right off the bat, man. Does James Tallarico have an actual chance of winning in Texas?
You know, I'll tell you, James Tallarico has a chance just in the fact that Ken Paxton is just so wholly corrupt. He also has a chance if he does what helped him win the Texas Democratic Senate primary. The way that he was able to beat Jasmine Crockett was by running on a message that really focused on working class people, talking about economic populism, and also calling out the billionaire class. Since he has won that nomination, I think there's been a lot more DC people in his ear trying to get him to do a bunch of other stuff, like talking about barbecue and this and that. And that's not really what he was good at. That's not really what people got excited about him for. And I think he really needs to start going back to playing the hits if he's going to have a chance. But, you know, the Republicans are really screwing up, not only for all the reasons I think folks know, but here in Texas, we're being invaded by the New World screwworm. Which is a really nasty critter that goes into infected cuts on cattle. And it's going to cost our cattle industry a lot of money and also lead to beef shortages in Texas in the midterms.
Wow.
Let me ask you this. In your opinion, would you say better or worse chance than Beto O'Rourke, who also famously almost was able to win in Texas?
I would put them I would put them next to each other just because I think what James needs to prove is what made Beto O'Rourke competitive in the first place. Was Beto O'Rourke was able to build an insane ground game. Beto O'Rourke just had so many people knocking doors for him, really engaged in his campaign. And James Tallarico has been able to bring a lot of excitement and a lot of money. And the question will be, as we get closer to November, whether or not he's going to be able to mobilize people to do that kind of door knocking. But when it comes to candidates, I think that, you know, Tallarico has a style and a kind of disarming nature that I think actually gives him an advantage over somebody like Beto, who was seen as such a firebrand. And I would also add that I think the Tallarico campaign has done a really good job at being able to, I think, signal to progressives and leftists, you know, that they're kind of on side without coming off as, let's say, alienating to moderates or independents.
How much do you think the Christian thing works for him? Because it's very, I'm like not the right person to be able to assess this. I find it kind of irritating, but I also get the feeling like, you can tell me if this is right or wrong, Democrats feel like this is what people want to hear, but I don't know, you know, like I co-host with Emily Jashinsky, who is genuinely like on the right and religious, and she finds it kind of irritating and grating.
But she's a Republican.
Yeah, she's a Republican. But I mean, that's what he's trying to appeal to, you know, the like George W. Bush Country Club, John Cornyn type Republicans and independents. I don't know. What is your sense of whether this like hits the right notes in Texas?
Well, one, I will just note, like, it's totally genuine. I've met James Tallarico a few times. Like, you know, you'll bump into him in the Austin area, you know, if you're on the left here. And he really much is who he is interpersonally as he is on camera. Look, I totally agree, Krystal. I don't think that this is going to really convince any evangelical voters in particular. But you know what it does, and why I think it actually is kind of effective, is that it gives people something to believe in. And I think this is one of the reasons that people really like James Tallarico, because it seems like he's interested in actually contesting votes, even if he might not be able to win them. So in the same way that like Beto O'Rourke, when he went to every county in Texas, you know, the eggheads will tell you that, like, oh, he actually didn't really flip many conservative counties over in that 2018 Senate race. But you know what it did? It meant for people in Houston and Dallas and Austin and San Antonio, when they're knocking doors, they felt that their candidate was like really serious about winning and really trying to win. So James Tallarico kind of contesting, you know, something that feels like untouchable for the left or for Democrats, you know, the church today. I think that gives people a lot of confidence. So I don't think it's the strategy around there. I don't think it's like a direct, we're going to win over hardline Christian conservatives, as much as it gives people who support him a lot to believe in and be excited about.
And what about on the Republican side? So Paxton defeats Cornyn in the primary.
Trump.
And you have this, I mean, sort of like the final blow to like the George W. Bush Republicans in Texas. Not that ideologically, I mean, there are some real ideological similarities between the Trump Republicans and the George W. Bush Republicans, but there's a big stylistic difference, et cetera. Do you think that there is some level of disaffected John Cornyn type George W. Bush type Republicans in Texas that could either be up for grabs or potentially just stay home and not be motivated to vote in that race because Paxton is such an odious figure?
I think the stay home is more likely than going to the other side. I mean, I think that one story that you're alluding to here, Krystal, is that people are missing about Texas is that like the old party, the George W. Bush party, is completely dead at this point. Not only is it dead, it's like it's if you mention those figures, they will get booed. At the Texas Republican convention, which is incredible if you think about it. This is a state that was strong Democrat throughout its history, and these were the people who flipped it and not only won the state but made it almost impossible for a Democrat to be competitive. So I think that and those people are still alive. You know what I mean? We're not talking about ancient history here. So I do think that there are folks who feel personally, offended by this. And maybe some of them will stay home. I also just think that, the Republican Party is doing everything it can to alienate the kind of new Republican voters. They're certainly doing with Hispanic voters. And they're also doing it with Muslim Texans, which is kind of surprising. But, there are significant groups of Muslim Texans who have voted for the Republican Party over the years. And this most recent Republican convention, I mean, the through line through it was a whole hysteria about, quote, Sharia law.
So I just pulled this up right now. Houston Chronicle, they say, and this is from a week ago, Paxton is leading Tallarico by just 1 percentage point when it comes to independents, 43% to 42%. And that's actually tighter than the margin in the poll when it was Ted Cruz versus Beto O'Rourke. Ted Cruz had a 5-point lead on him. I was looking for this number, but I couldn't find it. But I remember seeing a poll a week or two ago that said that there is a higher percentage of Cornyn voters will support Tallarico than vice versa. Sorry, my dyslexia is kicking in, and I just totally blanked on what the opposite of that would be.
Then Kamala supporters maybe that would vote for Paxton,
or Crockett supporters who would vote Paxton.
Okay.
I don't know. I forget that aspect of it, but I could tell you that it was a decent chunk of Cornyn voters, 20% or thereabouts, that were like, "I'm not voting for Paxton in any way, shape, or form." So I'm actually, I'm hesitant to say it because it's Texas, and every time it's like, oh, it's turning blue, and then it doesn't turn blue at all. But like there is something about this race to me feels different. And to your point, Krystal, about the religion thing, to me the religion thing, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, David, is it just exposes the right as the total frauds that they are because they pretend like they're all about Christianity. They pretend like they're all about religion. And then you get somebody who seems to genuinely be like a left-leaning Christian, and he talks about his religion all the time, talks about giving people health care, talks about, putting a roof over homeless people's heads and taxing the billionaires. And it really is like a very Christian-based message at the core of his campaign. And it just exposes the right as like, you're not actually serious about this religion thing. And if anything, the fact that like Emily doesn't like it, that's also the point to me, is that it like triggers the shit out of the right who are like, wait, the Jesus thing is our thing. And then it makes liberals and leftists go, ha ha, we got you, bitch. Like, that's right. This guy's a left-wing Christian, and we kind of like that.
I mean, I'll tell you, if anything, in the same way that like the right uses kind of culture war stuff to get the left in trouble, it does make the right expose themselves a little bit. I get what you're saying, Kyle. Like, I mean, at the Texas Republican Convention, which just happened 2 weeks ago, you had Dan Patrick talking about James Tallarico is going to hell. And look, you might not like James Tallarico, you might not find him inspiring, but no one's looking at somebody like that and be like, all right, that guy's Satan and is going to be going to hell. So I think it does expose, I think, the way that these folks and the Republican Party cloaks themselves in Christianity. And again, it's not the dominant version of Christianity in Texas, nor in the country, but there is, James Tallarico comes from like a legitimate church. There is a kind of progressive history of Christianity in Texas and across the South. Hell, there's a stronger one in the past as well. So I also think that, there's an aspect here where, again, it might not be winning over people on the right, but it does make them uncomfortable. And it also makes them talk about things that I don't think are winning issues for them.
Yeah. Every ad I've seen of Paxton immediately goes to trans people. It's like, Tallarico, trans people, be afraid. And it's like, Well, what is this doing?
Some of this gets into some of the themes of your book, because part of this is like a contesting of what it means to be a real Texan, right? And that's a lot of their attacks on him are basically like they're meant to emasculate him, and they're meant to call into question whether he really represents, a true Texas. And that's why his campaign is responding with like, here he is eating barbecue the way Texans do, So do you think that those attacks on him as like, too feminine, not tough guy enough, doesn't eat enough barbecue, maybe he's a vegan, maybe his girlfriend's a vegan, which kind of cuts against the emasculating part, whatever. Anyway, they're trying to imply that he is this like girly man that can't possibly represent the big, strong, tough Texas. Do you think that that is landing though with some demographic in the state?
I mean, I think it lands with a certain demographic, but I don't know if this is one that they need to win over. It lands with like Republican hardliners.
Yeah.
And as I write about in my book, and I talk about a lot, I think one thing people have to remember is that like Texas has had so many people that moved here in the past few years, in the past few decades. And a lot of times people kind of expect those to be liberals from California or New York. They actually tend to be conservatives. And those new Texans, they tend to also be a little bit uncomfortable with whether or not they're truly Texan. So they tend to overcorrect on wearing cowboy hats and eating barbecue. Doing all this kind of stuff. So the Tallarico's, and Tallarico, what, he's a 6th generation Texan or something like that. You know what I mean? Like he doesn't need to do any of this kind of stuff to lay claim to this place. So I think that, that's a kind of internal message within the Republican Party, right? And try to get these people excited to show up, because the Republican Party in Texas, one thing you have to understand why it's so paranoid and crazy is that because it has dominated politics so much, it has to create really, really, really scary enemies for the Republican base to make sure that they donate, that they door knock, and that they show up to vote. And again, I think that like this election is going to be much more competitive than ones in the past. So these kind of things that they're really focused on, kind of like emboldening like their hardline base, not just their typical voters, but like their hardline Republican base. I think it really misses for most normal people. Not to mention the weird AI slop ads that we've been getting this entire cycle.
Yeah.
When I learned about Ken Paxton, I was like genuinely floored, because I call this guy the second most corrupt politician in America, the first one, of course, being Donald J. Trump. But he's not far behind. And like, just to give people some examples here, he held investments in a company called WatchGuard that received millions of dollars in state contracts that he voted on. Okay, he very famously in 2013 apparently tried to steal a $1,000 Mont Blanc pen from another lawyer at a courthouse. Then he was caught and like sheepishly had to return it. In 2015, there was a securities fraud indictment where he was indicted on felony charges, 2 counts of securities fraud, 1 for failing to register, for allegedly promoting this company to others without disclosing a commission that he got paid. Like literally, we're talking about like cash in a paper bag level of corrupt, like Tom Homan Hamhead style corruption here. We also have in 2020 whistleblower allegations and an FBI probe. Top aides accused him of bribery and abuse of office to benefit one of his donors. His own aides in his office, who presumably are also Republican freaks, are going, you know what, this is a little too far even for me. And then, of course, you have this. I bring this up all the time. I'm surprised nobody else brings this up. He said to Steve Bannon on a podcast about the 2020 election that if it wasn't for him as Attorney General getting 2.5 million mail-in ballots thrown out, that Joe Biden would have won the state of Texas in 2020. That's not me saying, that's him saying it, that if it wasn't for me, Donald Trump would have lost Texas in 2020. So the number of scandals that we're looking at here, is it the case that if Tallarico ends up pulling it off, that he should really be thanking Ken Paxton, because he's so uniquely vulnerable and evil and corrupt that, like, it's almost gifted to him on a platter in a sense, even if he just ekes it out by like a percentage point or 2.
Dude, I mean, totally. And the thing about Paxton is like totally corrupt. And obviously his wife divorces him on, quote, biblical grounds, which is, probably one of the most incredible phrases I've ever heard in a divorce proceeding. But, yeah, I mean, he's as corrupt as they come. And I think one thing that people need to remember, in addition to all of those things that you just listed, Kyle, I mean, this is somebody who was, impeached in the trial, right? The corruption that exists in Texas because of Republican rule, the Senate let him off. Even though that the Republicans in the House saw him as a criminal, the Senate let them off. And there are plenty of reports, not from liberal things like Texas Observer, but Texas Tribune, of figures saying we were getting phone calls from big donors and from Greg Abbott and from major figures saying, like, if we don't vote to let Paxton off, you're done. And the next election cycle, Tim Dunn and a bunch of other right-wing billionaires shot a money cannon at anybody who broke with Paxton. So the thing is like Paxton, in addition to being super corrupt in the sense of like stealing from the public, right, which is bad enough, he also only exists because our politics in the state are so corrupt. And I think that this is one thing that Tallarico should really hit on is that, like, yes, it's Paxton, he's bad, but also all of these things in Texas that are failing. The electricity, we're going to run out of water in Corpus Christi, the unaffordability in the state, the fact that we set up special business courts for freaks like Elon Musk, the fact that in Texas, the state government has gotten involved in banning water breaks for workers. And I want to remind people of this. Texas is a state 100 degrees regularly, 100 degrees right now. We have laws on the books in Texas for what you have to do with a dog when it's hot outside. You have to give them potable water. You have to keep them in the shade. We don't have that for workers because of the Republican Party.
Jesus Christ.
So I think somebody like Tallarico hitting that message, in addition to the corruption of Paxton, is downstream from the corruption of the Republican Party.
So Democrats have done a lot of like demographic wish casting in Texas. It was like, oh, it's going to be a majority minority state, and then we're going to win. And it hasn't worked out that way.
To be fair.
Yet. But I mean, talk specifically about the Latinos in the state, who famously shifted significantly towards Donald Trump in particular. You now have a gerrymander that's at least partly based on the idea that they're now just part of the Republican Party, which is probably a very dicey proposition. What is your sense of how Tallarico is doing in winning some of those folks back and the issues that are, top of mind for, not to essentialize or say this is like one group and they all have the same issues in mind, but what do you think are the top issues in that community?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Texas is not, the dream of demographics is destiny is that, like, as Anglos, white people stop being the majority voting bloc in Texas, and Hispanics became that the state would flip, and that didn't happen. But there still are, a lot of things to kind of note about the way that the Republicans and the Democrats run, particularly in South Texas, right? And that's really what we're talking about here. Tallarico cleaned up in South Texas against Jasmine Crockett. And one thing that I think is really notable about James Tallarico's campaign was that he really followed the Bernie Sanders strategy and the Bernie Sanders map. So when Bernie Sanders ran in Texas, he didn't win in 2020, but he did fairly well. Where he did really well was with Hispanic voters, and then in like Austin and San Antonio and things like that. Tallarico built on that map and expanded it, and it's really interesting to look at them side by side. And he did it obviously by talking about things that those voters care about, like the cost of living, billionaires in politics, and jobs. And I think one thing that the Democratic Party has been really bad about is kind of recognizing what it is that motivates people to come out and vote. I think one thing that I think particularly leftists have a hard time reckoning with is why the Republican Party has done so well in South Texas. There's a part of it that is, kind of typical right-wing politics, and the fact that, like, on social issues, Hispanics can be more conservative than other voting groups. But I think one thing that's really important to note is that, like, Border Patrol, oil and gas, like, these are the kind of industries that exist there because it's a part of the state and the part of the country that has been massively underinvested in. It's also the reason why somebody like Elon Musk has set up shop at Starbase down near Brownsville, because they also have had a very long period of time of, like, effective Democratic Party machines, and people were revolting against that system that didn't really deliver for them, and had made their lives worse in many ways. So what Tallarico, I think, can do and should do, and hopefully is doing, is continuing to kind of build out in those communities off of that kind of Bernie Sanders strategy, which worked really, really well. And that was the real question between Crockett and Tallarico in a lot of ways, was like, are you trying to bring in new voters or irregular voters to the Democratic Party into the tent, or the Jasmine Crockett thesis was, we're just going to have like crazy numbers in the cities that kind of overwhelm the rest of the Republican base in the state.
How much of it too, though, I'm curious, you have this history of different groups that were considered minorities of the Irish, Italians, or whatever, who they, in their desire to be accepted, not as minorities, but into mainstream culture, they move, right? They become the cops, they become the firefighters. In this instance, they become the border patrol. And that since you have this idea of, being a Texan, being part of the majority coalition in Texas is about being part of the Republican Party and being sort of like conservative and right wing. I mean, how much of that is a factor as well, since you have, these are a lot of the Latino population in Texas has like been there for many years and generations. So it's partly an asserting of like, no, I want to be part of the like white mainstream culture in Texas and in the country.
I think there's a segment where that's the case. I also think that like if we ask ourselves the same questions about why do like white working class voters vote Republican, sometimes I think that like those things are also just going to play in Texas with working class Hispanic voters as well. And I'd really also tried to like harken back to like the jobs question, because like if you go down to the border, if you go down to Brownsville, I mean, it's really horrible, frankly, if you go down to Brownsville and you just see how militarized that border is, right on the the other side of the Rio Grande. There's another city that throughout all of Texas history, like they were sister cities. You could have lunch on one side, go back to the other, and it's just a complete war zone vibe now. But those jobs, I mean, those are some of the better paying jobs in the community. So again, and when we're talking about Hispanic voters like going towards the Republican Party, we're not talking super majorities. We're talking competitive winning majorities for the Republicans. So I think it's a mixture of a few things, but also I think one thing that the Republican Party has had is that like, hey, these jobs in immigration and also in oil and gas, like those are kind of dependent on us, and those will go away if you don't vote this.
And what's the response to that?
I mean, I think that you have to run on like actual economic renewal, right? You have to do, for example, if oil and gas is a problem for you, you need to run on something like a Green New Deal. I also would, argue that like you need to argue for something like a just transition, but really focus on like more working class issues. And then also when it comes to, things like climate change in Texas. I mean, we need to do a massive infrastructure overhaul in this state. And a lot of that work is going to be needed to be done in South Texas. I think being able to talk about those things and actually present like a real viable strategy for jobs and opportunities for people is what will be necessary so that people don't feel that they're maybe voting their conscience but hurting their wallet. And again, we're talking about moving to 10 to 15% of voters on these kind of things.
Well, that brings me to your book. So let me bring up, the name of the book is The Myth of Red Texas. It's a phenomenal book. And I think I would venture to say that the overwhelming majority of even political junkies don't really know the history of Texas, and the fact that the idea that it's inevitably red is a complete misnomer if you go back in the past and you look at the movements that have come out of there. So tell everybody a little bit about that. Some of the things that, caught my eye, and I was like, well, I had no idea about this. You have this stereotype of the cowboy as like the individualist, the loner, who like, they're all about themselves, smoking a cigarette out there in the wilderness, like handling their business, doesn't need anybody. But in reality, as you lay out, it's quite the opposite. In fact, cowboys were early labor organizers, which of course is a left-wing thing. So explain everybody about the history of Texas.
Yeah, I mean, Texas has this very interesting radical working class and labor history that, by the way, has been like purposefully put down. It's not an accident that most people don't know this story. But I mean, the cowboy strike in Tuscaloosa, Texas, that's up in the Panhandle, and this is a story where the state is changing dramatically. And, this new landowning class comes and moves in, and they start squeezing the workers. They start harming, these actual working cowboys, not the guys sitting up high in the big house, but the people who are actually working the cattle. These cowboys organize themselves into this extremely successful strike. It's so successful, I argue in the book, and Mark Laus, who's a really great scholar who wrote a long book on this, that this probably happened, they won the strike in a matter of days. And there's a long period of time after the fact where the bosses start using the blacklist, hiring Texas Rangers, and attacking these union and labor organizers to eventually bust and destroy the union. But the way that the story is always told or presented is like, oh, these cowboys try to go on strike, but there's something about cowboy work that is incompatible with being a union member or labor organizer. But the fact is that this is the same thing that happened in the railroads, the same thing that happened in iron workers, in industry all across the country, was that the bosses didn't want to play by the rules, and they used every tool that they had in their tool shed, including killing labor leaders. I write also about barbed wire, which is like a very classic example of what it means to be a Texan. Barbed wire engulfs the state, and it was used again by this like northern and European landowners to try to enclose upon the open range. And the cowboys back then, they fought against this. At first, they were just cutting down barbed wire fences because the bosses were using it, the rich were using it to kind of cut off access to water, cut off access to market, take more land than belonged to them. But eventually, the cowboys just started hating the image of barbed wire in general. They called it the devil's rope, and they organized themselves into these incredible gangs: the Blue Owls, the Blue Devils, the Javelinas, and my personal favorite, the Knights of the Nippers. And all across Texas, there is what was known as the fence cutting war, where these gangs would go out at night and you would hear the pop pop every evening of company thugs chasing after these cowboys who are fighting against private property, the enclosure of the open range. And like these are just a couple of the stories that I get into in the book. But really, there is this kind of like radical left wing tradition, like very old tradition in Texas, that ends up inspiring the populist movement. Texas was where populism was born. It ends up inspiring the socialist movement and in large part the labor movement in Texas. And this is a history that has been in large part forgotten in the state. And I would again argue on purpose, particularly in the 50s during the Red Scare, there was this real attempt to try to paint a very specific version of Texas. The idea that Texas is automatically conservative, automatically believes in these things like private property and capitalism. But when these things came here, people resisted them with all of the stubbornness and grit that you would imagine that Texans would fight against something that was a threat to their life and their livelihood. And I think it's a good thing to remind ourselves here in Texas and the rest of the country of this tradition if we want to change the state today.
The Republic. Sorry, Chris. Let me just point this out. Yeah. The Republican Party. This is an interesting fact that I got from Noam Chomsky. But the original position of the Republican Party, Abe Lincoln's Republican Party, is that wage slavery, also known as having a job, is not much different than chattel slavery. That's like the original roots of the Republican Party. So there was a time in this country where very radical ideas, what we'd call radical today, were actually looked at sort of like common sense ideas. And Krystal, I know you've talked about hidden history as well. What was that movie we watched called Matewan, or is that how you say it? Matewan?
Yeah.
And that's like Matewan. Okay, that's the labor history in West Virginia, right? About how you had these company towns, and it was basically like these people were living in slave-like conditions, and they organized together. Then they get like murdered by the bosses, right? And this is stuff that they hide on purpose so people don't know that there's a rich history and tradition, and that we should be learning this right alongside the other, important movements in our history, like the civil rights movement, like the women's rights movement, like the labor rights movement is equally as important, and it really gets hidden.
Yeah, actually, as you're talking, and as I've engaged with your book, it does remind me of some echoes with West Virginia history, which I'm much more familiar with. Where including when you're talking about like, they're like, you want these oil and gas jobs, right? You better vote for Republicans. That really is the primary way that they destroyed the Democratic Party in West Virginia, was this whole Friends of Coal movement, and like, if you vote for those Democrats, they're going to take your job, and because this is an economically depressed place, and this is the only industry that has any investment whatsoever here, that's going to be basically a death sentence to you. And then they have actually banned the teaching of some of the radical labor history in the state of West Virginia, which is renowned. Yeah, so it does remind me of some of that. I'm curious too, though. I mean, the other tactic that is always deployed, continues to be deployed against left-wing and populist movements, is to try to exploit racial divisions. And they certainly did that in West Virginia. They would bring in scabs from out of state. There's just all sorts of use of weaponization of race to try to undercut a multiracial working class coalition. I wonder how important that was in Texas in particular in defenestrating the power of the Populist Party.
Yeah, well, when it came to destroying populism, this ends up being a really important aspect. So populism rises in Texas. It becomes the second major political party in the state. And actually, I argue in the book, 1896, that the populists actually won the gubernatorial election, and the Democratic Party refused to seat them.
Wow.
They stuffed ballot boxes. And again, this is not just me as like a lefty saying this. Like, there are a lot of scholars that agree with this position. And one of the things that was really interesting about the populists, not a perfect relationship between white and black workers in that movement, but it was actually a political party that it had both groups in it. So immediately after this radical movement rises, that's when Jim Crow comes to Texas. That's when the rights to vote get restricted here. Texas was actually a fairly late state in restricting the right to vote for Black people. But through things like the poll tax and literacy tests and things like that, they also were disenfranchising poor whites as well. So what ends up happening in Texas is because there's this radical revolt against the system, you have this kind of like racial restriction that comes in. But I think, Krystal, like the really rhymes with what happened in West Virginia that I find really interesting is the way that the bosses use race against, use blacks and whites against one another. I write about the Brotherhood of the Timber Workers, which is this fascinating interracial union in Texas and Louisiana at the time. And it's totally crazy because you can read letters from the bosses where they're saying things like, hey, at this facility, the whites are asking for too much. We're going to bring in black scabs, and vice versa, to try to get people to pit each other against race. What was really interesting about the Brotherhood of the Timber Workers is that they were in a lot of ways able to overcome this at a moment in Southern history where not just interracial unions were unheard of. Black people and white people being able to fraternize in public was barred legally. And these unions continue to flout this. What was really interesting too about the Brotherhood of the Timber Workers is not just that it was interracial, but it was actually they extended membership in the union to the wives and the girlfriends of the Brotherhood of the Timber Workers. The argument being that they had just as much stake in the success or failure of the union, and it ended up being a really good disciplining tool for the union, because if somebody got went a little cowardly and thought about scabbing on the union, their wife would say, well, I'm going to leave you for a real man because a real man is in the union. And it was really effective. But, you have this really fascinating moment, I think, throughout this book and throughout this history of not a perfect path, but I think a path that is heartbreaking to read and to study, because you can actually see a different path out of what we all know is about to come in the South, the racial regime that is about to really ramp up in the next few years. And, the promise, the possibility of like an interracial solidarity amongst working people was really crushed legally, physically, and, mortally by the bosses.
Most people don't even know that Texas had a socialist party, right? So tell everybody about this guy. It sounds like I'm making this up. I swear I'm not. Red Tom Hickey.
It's so good. I mean, and he seemed, I'll tell you one thing just really quick. And I think most leftists will note this when they talk about any kind of left-wing socialist history, is those people had a lot of fucking fun. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry.
It's all right. You can curse here.
Those people ended up having, the parties and the kind of sideshows of that period are always really interesting to me. But yes, no, Texas has this massive socialist party, and it really gets born out of the defeat of populism. And again, populism isn't defeated politically; they just effectively, make it they make it illegal for a lot of the voting base to vote.
Jesus.
And then there's also a lot of defections from the more conservative members of the populist movement to the Democratic Party. So socialism kind of rises out of this, and because people just saw what they experienced under populism, they start to take a more radical and revolutionary approach. Right? They don't think that they can just, reform capitalism. They start arguing that they need to abolish it. And Texas has this massive socialist party again. Not just a socialist party in Texas, but one of the largest socialist parties in the United States of America. And it was right here in Texas. We could talk about some of the political things, but I think one thing that's really interesting is they had these things called encampments, which they would have around this time of year. Most of the workers there were cotton farmers. So they would have these huge parties, literally thousands of people. They would meet at, in a field or somewhere with water, and they would put up tents, and they would just have this huge festival and carnival, very much, like a kind of like Christian revival. But they were talking about socialism. They were learning science. They were learning evolution. And they actually taught people how to read. Which is an interesting thing to think about, that there are Texans today who their family member might have learned how to read at a socialist encampment. And Eugene Debs, Mother Jones, all of these major figures of the early socialist movement would come down to Texas and deliver these speeches, again, to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But, the socialist movement is really fascinating. They have this guy, Redden Andrews, who is a Stetson-wearing former president of Baylor who runs for governor, ends up overtaking the Republican Party as the second major political party in Texas. And they end up having really interesting relationships with the Mexican Revolution. When the Mexican Revolution really starts kicking up, the Texas Socialist Party, the Rebel, which was the name of their newspaper, it starts translating essays from Spanish into English, and they start sending essays to the radical Mexican newspapers as well. They're translated in English, and it just, it's a totally fascinating moment. I think it would make a really good movie to see about some of these kind of cross-border fights and things that are going on in South Texas with these predominantly Anglo-white Texas socialists, just standing in total solidarity with figures like Pancho Villa, while their white bosses and the landlords in Texas were very, very afraid of the Mexican Revolution coming across the Rio Grande.
So what happened? You mentioned that the McCarthy era was sort of important in solidifying Texas's, right-wing really identity, and erasing a lot of this history and tamping down on some of these left-wing agitating movements. What's the story of how we get from there to here. To George W. Bush and Ken Paxton and Ted Cruz.
It feels like they always have to cheat to beat us, like we're criminalizing you, like, oh Jesus, what?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a quick and easy way to say that is that, they basically just restrict democracy. They do with the populace restricting the vote on the racial line. The Socialist Party effectively becomes illegal. They shut down their newspapers. They arrest its leadership. Even though it was ascending, it kind of gets crushed very quickly. Not just by the state government, by the way, but by the federal government. The Rebel was the first paper shut down under the Espionage Act. But you have this McCarthyism, and we probably don't have time to get into it, but Emma Tenayuka, who's an incredible labor leader in San Antonio, she literally gets chased out of the state by kind of right-wing goons. And I think that's like a kind of good capstone on what ends up happening to this radical history. But in the period since, from the 40s to the 80s, the Democratic Party is dominant, but there's a conservative and, let's call it a more liberal wing of the party. But over the years, the liberal wing gets weaker and weaker. Ironically, as Republicans start becoming more competitive in Texas, you actually had a movement amongst liberals to kind of kick the conservatives out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, their belief being that they would be more competitive and they could at least vie for power then. They did end up getting their wish a few years later. But what really ends up changing Texas from Democrat to Republican is in the 80s, we start seeing massive amounts of corporate relocation to Texas. And you have people who never, who consider themselves to be Republicans, who are very willing to vote in the Republican Party. No problem with that. And then you see the opportunity of figures like Rick Perry, who end up switching parties. But in many ways, what ends up really killing the Texas Democratic Party is the betrayal of the Democratic Party to workers. You still had a strong New Deal coalition. You still had a strong LBJ coalition. Ann Richards, who I'm going to get hate for this, and look, I grew up in a house. We had a picture of Ann Richards up on our fridge. You know what I mean? I have love for her. But, she was a big NAFTA supporter. And when she lost, what did it mean to be a Texas Democrat? It did not mean that kind of older populist or that older New Deal style liberalism. So you get this influx of new Texans and this kind of degradation of the Democratic Party. And the way I like to put it is that there is a tradition that's worth reviving. It's worth being confident that there's a kind of left-wing populist tradition in Texas. A statistic I always like to note for people is in 2018, when Ted Cruz went up against Beto O'Rourke, if the right to vote was restricted just to native-born Texans, Beto O'Rourke would have been the senator from Texas. It was the new Texans that put Ted Cruz over the top. So, people on the left, a lot of times, including Texans, they treat any left-wing movement that we have today as something kind of being imported. You know what I mean? Like, these people from California are bringing their ideas here and changing the state. No, it's actually the Republican Party that has done that. And we should be a little bit more confident and not let people like Ted Cruz get to walk around and act like they're the one true Texans.
As you're talking here, I'm thinking about how Tallarico and his campaign, it really does strike me that he brings up corruption a lot. He brings up billionaires a lot. He brings up healthcare a lot in a way that I don't think Colin Allred really did, in a way that even Beto O'Rourke, I don't think he did anywhere near as much as Tallarico does. And, a lot of Texas's political identity currently feels like it comes out of repetition. sort of like that Trump trick of repetition. Like, we are conservative, we are capitalist, we are individualist, we believe in Texas-style liberty and freedom. And I do feel like there's a little bit of a shift happening now where, with Tallarico always bringing up corruption and billionaires and healthcare in a way the previous Democrats didn't, it feels like the door's sort of open in a way that perhaps it wasn't previously, where he's tapping in, even if it's just in more of an abstract way, he's sort of tapping in to the history of labor organizing in Texas and the history of the socialist movement and the populist movement. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think he could do more. I really think he could do more, but he's certainly pivoting towards it, like away from somebody like Colin Allred. Colin Allred ran the same playbook that Texas Democrats have been doing forever, which is like run as far to the right as possible. I think Tallarico does kind of speak better, to this history. But I'll tell you, if you want to look at something to be really excited about, it's the victory of Taylor Ramette up in Tarrant County. People might not have seen this, but Tarrant County is which is where Fort Worth is, one of the most red counties in the state of Texas, urban counties at least, in the state of Texas. Trump won it by, I think, 17 points. A Democrat, Taylor Ramette, flipped it by 14 points. And he was a labor organizer, a union leader. And whenever they tried to get him on, should whomever be playing sports in whatever league and all this kind of stuff, he was just like, I'm kind of worried about whether or not people can afford food or their kids can get a quality education. Right. And he completely sidestepped it and won a district, again, that Trump won 17 by 14 points.
Wow.
And so there is, I think, a viability, and I think there are some people within the party who are recognizing that this is the case. The problem is the leadership of the Texas Democratic Party doesn't know up from down. It is a totally decrepit party. I'm talking about like the organization itself. Right. So you have to build up a campaign apparatus on your own. And I think Tallarico has shown some capacity to do it. I think that those are the things that get people really excited about him. And I think that it's going to be really important that he does kind of double down on what got him into this position in the first place, instead of, I think, falling, into the trap of like hyper-focusing, on Ken Paxton. Hit him, obviously, but like really give people some reason for them to vote for you, not just that the Republican Party is bad. But there's going to be a really wild election, just given the state of like the chaos within the Republican Party over the past few years. They're at war with one another. You have our current agricultural commissioner like waging war with Brooke Rollins over the screw worm. There's a lot of dysfunction in this state, and also maybe this is me being naive, but I just I can't imagine that the kind of nastiness, the ugliness of somebody like Brandon Gill, or this kind of like anti-Muslim panic that they're whipping up, it's just going to be sustainable. Or at least I hope that that's not the case, because it'll be much, much harder to be here.
Yeah, that really contrasts with that strain of just outright bigotry, xenophobia, Islamophobia. It really contrasts with the reality of what Texas actually is today, which I would love for you to speak to, which is a very diverse state. It's a very urban and suburban state. It's very much associated with the cowboy and the frontier and all of the range and all of this. But the reality of Texas is actually quite different.
Yeah, Texas is, one of the most urban states in the United States. And, in addition to obviously being a racially diverse state because of our history, it is also becoming more and more a hub for immigrants. If you are somebody who's coming to the United States of America right now, you're not going through Ellis Island, you're not going to New York City, you're going to Houston. And this has been something that, has been something that the Republican Party actually used to brag about. Greg Abbott used to brag about the fact that Texas was attracting more migrants from the world, than any other place. Now, obviously, we're getting all this kind of disgusting attacks within the Republican Party, particularly against Muslims, but also against Indians too. I think there is a misunderstanding of Texas as rural. Texas has the most rural voters, like as a population, but Texas is one of the most urban states. We're talking some of the largest cities in the country: Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio. I'm not going to list all the cities here, but it's an extremely urban part of the country. And the myth. I wrote a book kind of busting it a little bit because these myths are really strong. I think there always will be a distinctness about being Texas. I think it will always kind of relate to the past in some way or another, which is why I actually think it's so important for us to be able to contest these mythologies. Because if you feel like you're kind of breaking away from where you come from to uphold certain policies, plenty of people will break, but enough folks will stay back, that'll be harmful. So being able to actually give people the confidence to say like, hey, be proud of your history, be proud of being a Texan. You're actually part of a longer tradition. I think is going to be something that will be really, really necessary to flipping the state. And I would just add, too, on the urban question, the one thing that is really notable too is that our cities are fairly blue. I mean, in Austin, we have a Democratic Socialist City Council member, Mike Siegel. San Antonio has 3 DSA City Council members. We're winning victories all across the state of Texas in the cities. And one of the things that the Republican Party has done in response to that is try to restrict the ability of cities to be able to govern, to be able to pass things like water break restrictions, like we were talking about earlier. So I think that there's also going to be a very important fight in the next few years if we want to see a progressive shift in Texas, to kind of pushing back against this state government overreach that's preventing millions and millions of the majority of Texans to be able to govern themselves.
David, do you ever look at Ted Cruz and just think like, come on, man? Like, what the fuck? If you're a Texan and you're looking at the national landscape, you're going, really? This motherfucker? This gelatinous weirdo with the nasally voice who makes Donald Trump seem like a likable guy? I mean, that's what the 2016 election came down to, is people looked at Ted Cruz and Trump and went, Trump is much more relatable. Yeah. The billionaire with orange paint on his face is much more relatable than I'm Ted Cruz, me. So how do Texans actually feel about this man?
I mean, there's a good chunk of Republicans that love him, but I'll tell you, I mean, he is
very hard to fathom.
He is certainly loathed, and I mean, this guy is such a freak. I mean, even in high school and college, was kind of walking around the hallways, uttering and like kind of pretending that he was the president of the United States. I mean, this guy has always kind of had ambitions for this kind of stuff. And what's really weird about him too is that it's always surprising to me when somebody has the power that they do and they just want to do our job.
Right. So true. So true.
So funny.
There's so many of them. That, they have these, they're a senator, they're a congressperson, or they're running for president, but really they're like angling to get a podcast within the top 500 podcasts in the country.
Director of the FBI.
Yes. Cash Patel, Pete Kegsbreath. Jesus Christ.
One thing I wanted to, let's just fantasize for a moment, okay? Imagine Tallarico wins. What do you think that will trigger in terms of self-reflection from the Republican Party? Because Kyle is shaking his head. He's like, there will be none.
well, what I was going to say is, I don't know if they'll sit him. That's what I'm afraid of.
Well, let's put that aside for a second. Right. Okay, let's indulge the fantasy. Okay. It was a real blow to the Democratic Party when we lost Wisconsin to Scott Walker, who's like this anti-union freak. And this is one of the, the birthplaces of the labor movement in America. So you had that. You had Trump winning the blue wall, breaking the blue wall and winning the blue wall states. And that was a real blow to the sort of self-conception and triggered a lot of, analysis and hand-wringing about what do we do and how do we change this and how do we win these states back, what's going on, et cetera. I feel like losing Texas, kind of especially to James Tallarico, because he isn't this like big tough guy swearing whatever. I do think that would, and he does have some like peak woke tweets that are like, okay, totally. Racism is a virus or whatever, and it can't be because you have white skin, like you already automatically have it, whatever. There were some things, okay, that were said. A lot of mask wearing that, they love to use.
Well, I mean, the vegan thing actually came from something that he was doing at his events where they weren't catering meat.
Yes, yeah. So anyway, what will it do to the Republican Party? How will they process this loss if this were to actually occur?
I mean,
or maybe they just lie and say, well,
no, I think it's a great question, Chris. I mean, I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. I'll tell you this. I think one thing that would be tough for them is the fact that like this party has gotten so insane that it's actually like failing at governing.
Yes.
And like even on the principles and things that they want to do nationally and certainly in Texas, like they are incapable of doing it. I mean, our property taxes are still through the roof in Texas. I mean, we got 3 decades of Republican, control of the state. And they can't do anything about that. But especially in the past few years, it has been a bloodbath. And I know these are like state races, so they don't get a lot of national attention, but they have basically like kicked out any kind of normal Republican. Or actually, I shouldn't even say that, because what they have now is not even about their ideology. It's just people who are total cucks. It's like people who will take orders from their from Daddy Trump or from Daddy Abbott, and they will do their bidding. And if they have to actually recalibrate, I think it will be really hard for some of them to walk this back, along with the fact that they have kicked out all of the reasonable people in the Republican Party. I don't know if they can be if they lose, they would have to kind of look at, for example, the last chairman of the Texas Republican Party was an Indian man, Indian immigrant to Texas, and the entire convention was just like a whole revolt against the fact about how unnatural it is for Texas to have somebody like that as a
Oh my
leader of the
God,
Republican
Jesus
Party.
Christ.
And it's like, how can you go back to trying to win the places that they need to win when they kind of double triple down on this? I mean, there's always been an aspect of Republican Party that I feel like is like death drive. You know what I mean? Like they're just trying to bring the apocalypse, and maybe that is just kind of something that, I can't wrap my head around that is truly what they're doing. But the way that they have brought in Christian nationalism, white supremacy and things like that back into this party in the open side, not just in the back rooms, I think it'll be really, really difficult for them to have that, reckoning that they would need to do. And again, that's if they lose. Right now, they have so much power that they don't feel they need to compete, and that's why it's gotten this way, right? They don't feel like they need to compete.
I think if my own theory of what they would do if Tallarico were to actually win is they do the whole they'd blame California's moving to the state.
They just won't acknowledge.
And then they'll do the the Stephen Miller thing, like the import the third world, become the third world. That's probably what they'll do. Like, this wasn't a legitimate loss because the voters who voted for Tallarico are not legitimate voters. They're not legitimate Texans. They're not legitimate citizens. And they'll also probably just lie and say it was rigged.
100%.
Yeah, I think that'll be the direction that they probably go in. Racism, basically, is the direction that they'll go in.
As you guys were talking, I was reminded again of that Thomas Massey quote, where he said, I thought Republican voters were voting for libertarian ideas and liberty, but it turns out they were just voting for the craziest motherfucker in the race. And that's kind of where they're at now. Like you said, David, they can't even govern anymore.
Think about Dan Crenshaw. I mean, remember a few years ago, we were all talking. I mean, I won't put words in y'all's mouth, but a lot of us were talking about Dan Crenshaw. It's like, oh man, this guy, could maybe be, a major figure in the Republican Party. He was scary to a lot of folks. I mean, they completely kicked him out of the party. And he was a lunatic,
right?
In my opinion,
not lunatic enough, though. Not lunatic enough.
Well, just not subservient enough to Trump. And I mean, I think this is the thing that is going to be interesting. I mean, I'm worried to see where it goes, but to see what happens post-Trump. I mean, if Trump doesn't run in 2028, what is DeSantis versus Greg Abbott, in that Republican presidential primary? I mean, do y'all think that the Republicans are kind of setting themselves up right now for this post-Trump world? I'm not seeing too much of it yet, but I feel like that would be a good strategy. If I was somebody talking to Greg Abbott and I wanted to have a longer political career, I would tell him he needs to start figuring out ways to kind of distinguish himself from Trump because, I think they're going to walk out of this presidency.
They're going to be cooked. It's going to be worse. Remember after the Obama era, do you guys remember where Democrats lost over 1,000 state seats across the country, and then there was this sort of, this void after Obama where the party really wasn't set up for a post-Obama moment.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be like that on steroids. I think it's going to be like that times 1,000 because Trump, like every authoritarian leader, he doesn't want an heir apparent. In fact, he's rat fucking everybody who theoretically could be an heir apparent, whether it's J.D. Vance, who he humiliates regularly, or Marco Rubio, who he also humiliates regularly. He doesn't want it. And so once Trump is gone, they're going to be in the fucking wilderness. There's going to be a void. And I think what they're going to land on is, naturally, white nationalism and Christian nationalism. And it's just like, who's going to package it? Who's going to sell it the best? But I really feel like, the Democrats, really through no credit to them, are just de facto going to win all over the place. This is why we saw not only people that we like, DSA type candidates winning everywhere, but you also saw milquetoast centrist Democrats, in Virginia with Abigail Spanberger or Mikey, whatever her name is, Cheryl. She also, these were not really interesting candidates, but they ended up also winning by double digits.
Or the dude, I always forget his name, who's the attorney general of Virginia now, who was like,
Jay Jones.
I want to murder my opponent's children.
Yeah, that guy should have won by 300 points.
You're not a Republican. Whatever.
I mean, that's where we're at now,
I personally think it depends a lot on whether Trump is alive or dead. If he's dead, it's a different deal. But I don't think that Republicans are making the wrong political calculation to just stay close to him, because I think he will continue to dominate and control the Republican Party, even if he is not in office. And I mean, this is what you see. Like, for all the talk of, oh, you know, Tucker has this power base and he could run for president as a Republican and he could win, et cetera, et cetera. When you actually poll Republicans, they don't like him because he crossed Trump and Trump said mean things about him. So he's on the outs now. So I don't know. I think as long as Trump is still alive and kicking, he's going to continue to exercise a lot of control over the Republican Party. Now, I think that will be a disaster for them electorally. You know, totally. I don't think that J.D. Vance with Trump's blessing, or Don Jr. with Trump's blessing, which I don't put off the table, or Marco Rubio or whatever. Like, I think Trump is, in the same way Obama was not able to transfer his coalition over to anyone else, Trump is not able to transfer his coalition over to anybody else. So, you know, that's the direction that I think the party is going in, if he is still around. If he's not, then it's going to be a free-for-all, and God only knows what comes out of that.
And David, before you jump in, let me just add a little thing to that, Krystal, to show how right you are. There's been 30 to 40 notable cases in 2022 where the Trump-endorsed candidate won the primary and lost the general. Because there was just like, you're fucking psychotic, and people couldn't countenance voting for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was just going to add that, you know, one kind of signal, at least in Texas, that I've been kind of watching and interested in was Sid Miller, who's the current Texas ag commissioner. He was somebody who, you know, actually got the Trump endorsement in his reelection bid, but was unseated by a Greg Abbott and a kind of more Texas Republican Party establishment challenger candidate, Nate Sheets, who's like a weird like honey importer, basically. Sid Miller is like a fascinating guy because he's criticized Abbott very publicly. He's always been kind of willing to, you know, to challenge the Republican Party. Maybe the ag commissioner race isn't like the most important thing in the world, but it was an interesting moment of seeing that there are some Republicans in Texas who are willing actually to take their marching orders more from Republican Party establishment in the state than from Trump. Now, again, Trump called Sid Miller his guy in Texas, but Trump wasn't obviously stumping and going crazy for this figure. But, you know, there are these kind of cracks. And I think that one thing to note about Texas in particular is that Greg Abbott, Paxton is a lunatic, right? Greg Abbott, I think, is monstrous in many ways, but that guy really knows how to win in politics. I mean, he has had a lot of lives. You know, the busing thing that he did, while I thought it was extremely cruel, you know, that ended up being very effective at kind of souring. Yeah. And he's somebody who, you know, we were talking about how the Republican Party, the Bush Republican Party is dead. You know, Abbott comes up in that movement. I mean, in many ways, he was like one of like the foot soldiers of the George W. Bush Texas Republican Party, and now he's seen as totally MAGA. So I think that he's somebody who has a capacity to kind of move with the changes. The question is, does he want to stay governor of Texas forever? I mean, he's already our longest serving governor. So seeing where he goes after this will be interesting. But, you know, there are some cracks in the Republican Party, not particularly good ones. You know, I wish it was more Massey style stuff.
Right. Yeah, totally. No, that is not what it is. My favorite fact.
Like, it's the crack is like, do we hate Muslims or Jews more? That's the crack in the Republican Party.
Well, and I will just add that, you know, this whole like working class Republican thing, I mean, that didn't really have a lot of legs, did it? I mean, people really, I think, got really ahead of themselves in 2024 with that prediction.
Yeah. What do you think will happen with the Texas gerrymander? Do you think that opens up some possibilities for Democrats? Do you think it's a dummy mander, to use the jargon?
Backfire. Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, yeah, it certainly makes more districts competitive. I mean, the conventional wisdom now is that even if it doesn't mean more Democrats, you know, pick up seats, it makes Republicans waste a lot of money on seats that they probably wouldn't need to in the first place. You know, so I think that that's one of the bigger advantages of it. You know, I've been watching the congressional races. I think some of them are going to be kind of surprisingly closer. There hasn't been one that has like really stuck out to me yet, looking at the races that we've seen, which is a shame. I think one of the things that has been hardest for me in the past few months is watching all the success of our friends in New York City, and hoping we can figure something out here. Because, you know, at one time, I mean, we were Senate. I mean, Greg Casar was a DSA member, city council member, then elected to Congress. Like this this progressive movement here had some real strength, and I think it really needs to kind of recalibrate. I mean, Tallarico is great, but he's kind of outside. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's a different beast. So there's a lot to be excited about, but we need to figure out some way to get our own people on the ballot too.
We're all looking at New York City with a lot of jealousy.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that'll be my final question for you, David. Is like, I've been watching these, like the wave is finally here. Like I was a co-founder of Justice Democrats after Hillary lost. We wanted to do our version of the left-wing Tea Party and get like Bernie-style left-wingers elected across this country. And we were just a little too early. We were just a little before our time. It took a few more election cycles, but we're finally here. And, it almost feels like, I don't want to get overconfident, but it almost feels like the wave is just natural. It's like the default thing you do in a situation like this where Democratic voters are kicking the bums out, man. They're going like, oh, you've been there for 30 years? Fuck off. You obviously failed. Give me a Democratic socialist to take your place. So what's your mindset looking at this happening? Honestly, it's not now. New York City is sort of like where it started. But now it's not just New York City. Now it also happened in Colorado. I think it's going to happen throughout this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a moment right now where we've tried whatever that Republican stuff was. We've tried the centrist Democrat strategy, and now it is like these kind of economic populists. I mean, Graham Plattner, I think in many ways is the one I've been very excited about watching for many reasons. And I think that running candidates like this is the future. And I think we can win. And I think we can win in New York. I think we can win in Maine. I think we can win in the South and win in Texas. I think what's really going to be important is actually like getting the groups here, particularly like DSA here, to get like very strong and serious. New York doesn't happen if you don't have that kind of ground game, and right. Zoran doesn't happen if he doesn't win those assembly seats.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that's going to be really important for us is to either get like kind of rock star candidates like Graham, or just can kind of block off any kind of attacks and continue to convince voters to support them. That would be great, but I think more than what's going to be very, very important is actually like really getting serious about building those kind of ground game operations in Austin, in Dallas, and in Houston. There's people doing that work, but kind of doing with like the ruthless bureaucratic power that the New York City DSA has done, I think is definitely going to be what's needed.
Last question for me, back on Texas, but you mentioned screwworm, and I'm just curious, how much of this, how important is this in Texas? How much coverage is it getting? Because it got some national coverage and then kind of fell off, but I'm curious what that's doing to Texas politics.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, if this hits in the way that people are worried it's going to hit, it's already going to hit. There will be an increase in beef prices, and there will probably be, some level of shortages. How bad it gets is still an open question. Quick version of it. It's so crazy because I just we haven't talked about him. Thank God. It makes me happy to not talk about him. But one of my new neighbors, Elon Musk, who sometimes I feel like is personally trolling me, because he's moved to my hometown, made it horrible. And now he's coming after one of my favorite things in the world, which is, beef and brisket and steak. Because USA, these Doge cuts led to the New World screwworm coming into Texas.
Right.
It was one of those things you can even hear him in a meeting say, he's like, why are we paying to study this worm in Central America? And they cut all the funding for it. Now something that was eradicated in the 70s is in the state of Texas. And the real thing that's worrying about it, Krystal, is that it's definitely something that we can deal with. If you had a functional government, you could deal with it very quickly. We don't have a functional government, and they are committed to only using one tactic, which is using sterile flies, which I won't get into the weeds, but basically it's like there's one tactic they want to do, and it's going to take 2 years. They're saying like late 2027 for us to be able to create enough of them to be able to deal with this epidemic. And they're not wanting to use any other technologies that exist. And it is one of those things where these people are totally incompetent. Brooke Rollins, who's USDA head, she has no background in agriculture.
She's a lobbyist,
her background
right?
is she's a lobbyist and she's a Texan, and that's kind of it.
Oh my God.
I mean, it really is going back to the myth of Texas. This whole idea is like, oh, she's a Texan, she understands
she must
agriculture.
Know. Right.
It's totally ludicrous. So I mean, no, I think that it is definitely going to be. It's going to hurt the Republicans. I mean, this is the thing that is going to be interesting, is that the Republicans are going into this election with high prices on everything, and now we're going to go into high prices of beef, and high prices of beef that are directly affecting Texans who produce that. I mean, it's going to look really, really bad. The question is whether or not Democrats, Clayton Tucker's running for for Texas Ag Commissioner here in Texas, can they convince people to connect the things that they're frustrated about in their life is really the big question, I think. You know, and it's an open one because Democrats have had a really hard time connecting all the things that are wrong with Texas with the Republican Party.
I had read that the program to stop screwworm cost like $10 million, and they axed it out, and now to clean up the mess is going to cost about $1 billion.
Oh yeah,
classic Doge. Like, oh yeah, we're gonna, you know, get the budget in order, and then it's like, oh, we made it way worse. You know?
Yeah, I mean, studying the like mating habits of the screwworm sounds like, you know, it's exactly the kind of thing they would run on Fox News.
Right.
Like, oh, look at this wasteful spending, and actually, turns out that was a good use of dollars. Maybe like do that instead of using our money to bomb babies. How about that?
Yeah, they just don't care to like learn anything. They don't care to think like, hey, why do we do this? Maybe we should dig a little bit deeper. They're just like, sounds ridiculous, cut it off. You know?
Yeah, and that there's no real world consequences for anything. They're also like online brained and nihilist. That it's like, oh, nothing matters, right?
It's horrible.
I mean, I think they are. It's a nihilist party. I totally agree. It's just like a totally nihilist party. It's very scary.
It absolutely is, especially because they control every branch of government. But David Griscom, man, thank you for joining us. It was a hell of a lot of fun. Again, let me reiterate here. Everybody check out his Substack called The Rattler. Rattler. He's a co-host of Left Reckoning, and of course, he's the author of the phenomenal book, which I highly recommend, called The Myth of Red Texas. Definitely check that out, guys. Thanks for joining us, man. We appreciate it.
Thank y'all.